The risk configuration page is where I can configure my risk rules to attribute scoring on addresses or transactions based on exposure to entities, categories of entities, or even geographical location. What we call risk scoring might be better thought of as something like exposure scoring. We're adding points on a scale of 0 to 10 to screening results as a function of the incoming or outgoing exposure to what we set as triggers, like we see here. So every rule is comprised of a name, the triggers, and the risk distribution scale, which configures how many points will be added for how much percentage or dollar value exposure that we see. So the rule that I have selected here is called illicit activity. The triggers we've set are all of the categories relating to illegal stuff that people do online. So stuff like extortion, theft, credit card data vendors, Ponzi schemes, scams, all of those categories will trigger this risk rule. And then we'll look at the exposure on a percentage scale of the incoming or outgoing exposure to those categories that we've set. And then we're adding 1 point for every 10% exposure to those categories. So in addition to a percentage-based risk distribution scale, we can also accompany that with a dollar-based risk distribution scale, and this will be specifically for transaction screening. So if we have either a withdrawal or deposit, or we can think of it as an incoming or outgoing transaction, we can set those categories. We can set these categories as the trigger, and then we'll add points based on dollar value exposure to or from that transaction hash. So in addition to triggering risk rules based on percentage exposure or dollar value exposure, we can also set up rules that get triggered based on specific behaviors that we can call out, like peeling chains or what we call automated layering. So with peeling chains, this is going to be triggered by your typical peeling chain with a small amount of money being peeled off from the existing address into the destination address, where the large amount goes off into another unlabeled, unhosted wallet, at which point another small amount peels off to the destination, and then the large amount goes into another unknown wallet. For layering, this is just as it sounds. This is essentially adding additional hops between the sender and the recipient address. So with both of these behaviors, we can trigger a risk rule based on dollar value exposure to that behavior that we call out. So one potentially interesting way I can use risk rules, in addition to just finding connection to illicit activity online, is to sort of use them to label or filter addresses or transaction hashes that have a connection to a KYC exchange that I might be friendly with. So for example, I called this rule KYC exchange, and I called out the specific exchange entities that I know I'm friendly with, and they'll respond to a subpoena request that gets sent their way. For the risk distribution scale, I don't want to add any points of risk for that exposure to those exchanges. I just want to be able to filter out that sort of connection or that vector to those exchanges from a large list of addresses or transactions that I upload. So we'll score all those at 0, all the way from 0 to 100%. And then that'll allow us to filter by that triggered rule later on. So now I want to create a risk rule that specifically seeks out dark web activity, including dark forums, dark marketplaces, both centralized and decentralized, and then adds points of risk for percentage exposure to those categories of entities. To do that, I'll click Create New at the top left, and then I'll select Exposure as the methodology for this rule. For the name, I'll call this Dark Web. We're interested in both incoming and outgoing exposure, so we'll specify both withdrawal and deposit. For categories, I can partial match dark, and that's going to show all of the categories related to dark markets and dark web activity. So we'll go dark forum. We'll do both centralized and decentralized dark markets, and then just kind of run down the list with dark service and dark vendor shop. So these are the categories that are going to trigger this dark web risk rule, meaning any incoming or outgoing funds associated with an address that I screen is going to trigger this rule. And then we're going to look at the percentage exposure to those categories, total them, and then based on this risk distribution scale, that'll tell us how many points will be added. So as a default, we might see something like minimum score of 0 to a max score of 10 at 100%. And that gives us a scale of 1 point for every 10% exposure. If we really want to be granular here, we can also look at a proximity element to this risk distribution scale. That means that if I screen an address and it happens to be labeled as one of those dark web entities, we can automatically score that as a 10. Let's say we screen an address that's directly connected to a counterparty dark market or one of those dark web categories. I want to score that minimally as a 7 with a minimum contribution of 1% to sort of eliminate that trace exposure. So that means that 1% exposure will have that score of 7, and that's going to go all the way up to a 10 at 100% exposure. Then I can also look at indirect exposure, meaning 2 or more hops away. We're going to run our standard scale of 0 to 10 at 100%. And maybe I want to set a threshold where the minimum contribution is something like 1%. With that ready, I can save the draft. And then as an administrator for the risk rule configuration page, I can now approve and publish that rule. And that'll now be active within my environment.